All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some verses this morning. We're going to be in Exodus 19. You know, I remember reading over this passage quite a few times in the past. But in studying through it and hopefully being able to present it to you this morning, one of the goals is that I can impress upon you to try to picture yourself being there at Mount Sinai, because just reading through it, you know, we think of I've had the opportunity to visit many mountains. There was the Appalachians on the East Coast. People from Montana just call them hills, but they're mountains, and some of them are pretty tall. And the Rockies, spent lots of time around the Rockies. They're massive and they're majestic. And then in Burma, northern part of Burma, you can look off and you can see the base of the Himalaya Mountains, where Mount Everest is. Can't actually see Mount Everest, but mountains are impressive. They're not like, obviously they're not like hills, but when you look up at mountains and really picture how massive they are, so I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go through this, to help you to put yourself in the scene and help to appreciate the things that are going on here. I want to go over a couple of things this morning. One of them is the preparations that the people had to go through in order to meet God. You'd have heard people say, well, are you ready to meet God? You know, especially on signs along the road. There's some of them on 69 between here and in Indiana. Are you ready to meet the Lord? This is in reality, they are going to meet the Lord. So the preparations that they had to go through. And then God's descent on that mountain. And then lastly, the demand that God made for physical separation between the people and the mountain where he was. So, in Hebrews 12, you don't need to turn there, I'll read it. What it says there in verses 18 and 19, he says, and this is for us today, okay? For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard it begged that no further word be spoken to them. So we have the honor today of being able to approach God unfettered. They didn't. And that's what the Hebrew writer is trying to express there. So, when we look at the latter part of chapter 19 in Exodus, we enter upon really a new phase in God's history, in his revelation to Israel. Now, when we look back earlier in the entire book of Exodus, in the first few chapters, we see God dealing with the people in Egypt, the shock and awe that really was. That he dealt with them. But then now we're going to deal with a little different aspect of God. He's not done, or he's done with the vengeful part, the destruction part. The first time that God reveals himself to a multitude of people is in this chapter here. Previous to that, he has obviously made himself known to Abraham and obviously Adam and Eve, and a few individuals since then, Jacob, Israel. But now he is going to personally make himself known to a multitude of people, a nation. That's the first time. The second time that he is going to do that, obviously, was when Christ came. and he was going to make himself known to us through him. But this first introduction, if you will, to a mass of people was tremendous. Just the scene itself. Like I said, the first time earlier in this chapter, in the book of Exodus, he's dealing with the wrath, if you will, towards Egypt, the way they were treating Israel. But now, towards Israel, in the last half of chapter 19, we see him dealing with them in a whole different fashion, with kindliness, with fatherly affection towards them. Their wants, while they're in the wilderness up to this point, he meets all of their wants. And even when they kind of their murmurings, and it's with in a sense with a passing reproof. It's not really with a lot of anger. He's still dealing with them from a fatherly standpoint. But now Jehovah is going to take, and it's an awesome seat that he's going to take on top of Mount Sinai, and he's going to proceed to give them the law, and he clothes himself, if you will, even towards Israel, with this majesty and terror. When you hear those words with majesty and terror, you think that he's trying to terrify them. But I don't know of a better word to use than terror. But not from a. Well, it is fear, but it's from a reverent fear. I think everybody here has seen The Wizard of Oz, right? At the end of they do the best job that they can to terrify Dorothy, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Lion. Toto's not afraid, but the rest of them, he's doing everything he can behind the curtain to instill fear in them. Multiply that by 1,000,000 times, and you probably get even somewhat close to what it really had to be for them, for the Israelites, when they're at the bottom of this mountain. So this fact, that this majesty and terror is obviously really only one of significance when we really when we pay really close attention to what's going on. There's a what we call pomp and circumstance. Whenever the president is introduced to an audience, the band plays, I think it's Hail to the Chief, or I think that's the name of it, but whatever. And then even in the book of Acts, you see Paul referring to the pomp and circumstance when either King Agrippa or Bernice or whoever comes in, and he refers to that as pomp and circumstance. There's always that from a worldly standpoint, but when you consider the pomp and circumstance that God is displaying here, it's not to be minimized at all, because He is wanting to instill upon them the awesomeness of who He really is, and the holiness. And I'm going to deal with that holiness quite a bit this morning, because that when God reveals Himself here, it's not until He had already. He's not trying to scare the people. He had already blessed them in many ways, took care of all of their needs, destroyed the Egyptians, obviously, the Amalekites earlier than that, or before or after that. But if they hadn't really understood that God was a loving God before this instance, Can you imagine if they didn't know anything at all about him, that they hadn't seen what he had done to Egypt, that they hadn't seen all of the provisions that he'd taken care of for them, didn't know his loving kindness, provided food for them, manna, water from the rock, deliverance from their enemies. They understood that he cared for them. If they hadn't had that background, can you imagine standing at the bottom of that mountain and then seeing all of this appear before you, all of the situation? And we're going to get into that a little bit, some of the background. But they would have been terrified, but not from an awesome, but from a fear, a genuine terror. The fearful kind, not the reverent kind. So he took care of all of that to help them to understand that he was there for them. All right, so I want to read verses 10 through 16. That'll get us going here. Then the Lord also said to Moses, "Go to the people, consecrate them today and tomorrow, and have them wash their garments, and have them ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. But you shall set boundaries for the people all around, saying, 'Beware that you do not go up on the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall certainly be stoned or shot through, whether animal or person. The violator shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain.' So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. He also said to the people, 'Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman.'" Verse 16, "So it came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled." Okay, so there's a couple of million people in the camp by this time. So this scene at Sinai here was primarily a revelation of God's holiness. All right? So when we understand that, we realize how important it was for the preparations and the warnings of the people here. Now, one of the reasons for the giving of the law like this was to impress on them the holiness and the justice, that they are really part of God's character, and that they are really the basis for all of his dealings with us, his holiness and his justice. It really kind of, there's lots of different parts of his character, but the real basis of him is his holiness, and we're going to talk about his holiness and his justice. So it was at this time that God kind of chose that it was appropriate for the people, Israel, to meet him, to have his revelations be known to them. It had to be done at some point in history, and obviously now they're only a few months out of Egypt, and there was going to be no time better than this. Why wait for 10, 20 years? It was best for them to have this covenant up front, to understand a little bit more about who God is and what he expects from us. So the instructions for their preparations really kind of line up with this plan. And that was really the goal, to impress upon the people there that they had a sense of the holiness of the being in whom that they are about ready to meet, as well as their own unholiness and unfitness really to draw near to him. So holiness, if you really want to describe it, it's absolute moral purity and perfection. I don't know if there's probably lots of definitions, but let's kind of go with that one this morning. That holiness is absolute moral purity and perfection. So it refers to the desire for everything that is good, everything that is true, everything that is just and pure. Okay? There's not going to be a test, so you don't have to worry about trying to remember all of those, all right? So in God, it's really a determination to uphold at all cost that righteousness and truth. You know, as I'd mentioned previously, the big difference between our God and the gods of like Roman mythology and Greek mythology is that their gods were made in their own image, in the sense that they were built with emotions. They were described as they certainly weren't pure. They would get angry. They would war against each other. They would use people, us, as pawns in their scheming against each other. They would have little kingdoms that they would build up and tear down and fight against each other. They were made in man's image. So when God here, when we understand who He is, that everything that is pure and holy and just and pure and good, aren't we glad that we've got a God like that instead of a God like Zeus or Neptune or whoever, wherever you are? Those gods were not like the little g gods. We're not like our God. So what Moses is telling them is they needed to prepare to meet God. And they were going to meet Him right at the base of the mountain, and that they were supposed to sanctify themselves for 2 whole days. So that sanctification, obviously, it was mainly external, washing of clothes and things like that. But in itself was really a symbol of the need for inner purity. No doubt with, mental and spiritual preparations. In sports, we've got there's a term that's called putting your game face on, or, that you, people in, whether it be men or women in the locker rooms, they're preparing, for the moment that they're going to go out and they're going to compete. That's in a sense what's going on here, but it's for 2 days, and it's a spiritual. He wants them to sanctify themselves. What would you do if someone told you that you were going to meet God in 2 days or 3 days? Not that you're going to die in 3 days and go meet God, but in a sense, that's okay to think about it that way too. But if you were back then in the Israelite camp, and Moses comes down and tells you that you are going to meet God in 3 days, the God that you just saw, the power that He had, and everything that He had already accomplished, and you're going to meet Him in 3 days. Obviously, clean clothes would be the least that you would have to worry about. But you no doubt would spend a lot of time really contemplating meeting God. They didn't know that He was going to be in a cloud, that they were going to see His form. But they didn't know that. But we're told they're going to meet God in 3 days. I don't know, what would go through their mind. I don't know what would go through my mind. It would probably be the terror that spoke about a little while ago. But it would be awesome. There's no doubt about it. Now, in a sense, okay, so how would you prepare to meet God's presence in a few days? But also, we recognize that because the people here, let's face it, they were unregenerate, okay? They did not have the Holy Spirit within them. So they were still in their sins. They just left Egypt, okay? They knew very little about God except for, their teaching through the 400 years in Egypt. So were they really ready spiritually to meet God? No, they weren't. But one of the things is that even today, if someone approaches God today, unholy, he accepts them as long as they are penitent. And then they listen, they obviously obey scriptures and become a Christian. But he does not reject them initially at their approaching because they're unholy. We all came to God unholy when we originally approached. Okay, so that's the condition that they're in here. So the statement that is made in verse 13 is, it says, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. We've got to probably read that in light of verse 17 that says, and Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. I just, picture yourself in that throng of people that you're going to go up to the mountain and you're going to meet God. So the lesson that taught here is very respectful awe of God. Even when we have full confidence in approaching God as our Father, we shouldn't allow ourselves to forget there still is an infinite distance, that still exists between Him and us. In Hebrews 12:28, it says our service should be with reverence and awe. So there's still a reverence that is, He is still God, okay? He is our Father, but He is still God. So then I want to pick up in verse 16 through 17. I already read 16. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Verse 18. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the entire mountain quaked violently. When the sounds of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. As I tried to describe a mountain earlier, standing next to a mountain and then having it quake violently, along with fire and smoke and thunder and lightning, there would be lots of awesome and terror, no doubt about it. So the things associated with the descent were a thick cloud on the mountain, thunder and lightning, exceedingly loud sound of a trumpet. Now in Deuteronomy, when Moses he's recounting remember the book of Deuteronomy, he recounts all of their dealings with God up to that point. In Deuteronomy 4:11, he says, the mountain was burning with fire to the heart of the heavens, darkness, cloud, and thick gloom. Now, I don't know what thick gloom is, but I can imagine that it would be the feeling that people had, that you're just shaken to the bone. You're standing there with your mouth open. What else could you do? And then it says smoke as of a furnace, the mountain quaking. So the overwhelming terror is really more remarkable when we remember a couple of things. The first is that what we have here is not the judge, God, the judge, with the accused standing in front of him, trembling, convicted sinners to pronounce a sentence of death on them. No, what we have here is we have a God of grace. He is calling to himself a people that he loves and he has redeemed. He's just declared earlier in this same chapter that they are a peculiar treasure above all people. So he is not there as a can you imagine what it's going to be like on Judgment Day? If this is when he is calling his loved children in front of him, but on Judgment Day, the scene is going to be totally different. The audience is going to be different, for sure. But the terror on that last day, it's no doubt when Scripture says that every knee will bow, face in the dirt. So the design of this spectacle here was to give Israel a law that was really going to be the bond of a covenant between him and them, because he's setting the scene now is what he's doing. Now, the law is going to come in just a short time, but he is setting the scene for them to understand in the symbolic significance in each one of these symbols here. Each one of them means something different, but he is setting the scene to help them to understand this is a no pun intended, a monumental event. Okay, maybe that's where we got the term. I don't know. So the fire here is a symbol of holiness. Remember fire in the burning bush when he first confronts Moses with God? What does God say? He says, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the ground that you are standing on is holy ground." So the fire and it being holy. And then later, fire from heaven consuming the offering of Manoah. Remember, Manoah was Samson's father. Fire coming down and consuming the offering of Elijah on Mount Carmel with the confrontation with the prophets of Baal. So fire is a symbol of holiness. Thick cloud suggests mystery. When there's a cloud, there's mystery associated with it. It also tells of how God has got to be able to veil his face from man, or else man's going to be consumed by it. And then the smoke kind of speaks of wrath. In the King James Version, Deuteronomy 29, verse 20, it says, "The Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man." All right? So smoke is kind of an indication of the wrath of God. So now we've got to kind of back up a little bit, and it's like we have to ask the question, so why all of this terror? Why couldn't God have come to himself like in the form that he does later with Christ? Meek and lowly individual that no one would certainly be afraid of when you come across him, when you meet him. So why all of this terror? Well, a lot of it deals with what's going to come just afterward, and that is the giving of the law. The law is the revelation, if you will, of God's holiness. And in the revealing of that law, it demands holiness. That holiness has to be associated with it. So in order for the law to serve its purpose, it had to be given with all authority and with the majesty that's associated with this scene here. If it would have been, think of it if it would have just been given casually, if the law would have been given casually. Moses goes up on a mountain, very quiet, serene day, birds singing, breeze blowing, and he comes back with the 10 Commandments. And then eventually all of the other laws that 350 other laws that go along with it. Would it have been taken seriously? Not as seriously as what it is the scene here allows. So, there was time enough after the law was given that God could show his grace towards people that wouldn't necessarily hold up to all of the, maybe they fall short of the standards of the law. God could show his grace later, but initially the law had to be laid down, and it had to be laid down with force. This generation, probably, the Israelites here, it would have been a long time before they would have forgotten the scene here. So as noted here, a revelation of the law at some period of time, God had to be able to hand it out, and this was the proper time. So the full requirements of God's holiness really had to be made known. And sooner or later had to be brought, to light to the people. So God's purpose in forming this nation, obviously we had to bring them out of Egypt at first, and then a few months in their journey to Mount Sinai, but at the very beginning of them being a nation was the appropriate time. Now, when we consider the law, why was the law given? What was so necessary about the law? Well, as I'm going to read in a moment, it gives the knowledge of what sin is. Paul says in Romans 7:7, he says, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. Let's consider for a moment that God didn't give us a law. Wouldn't he be just like those gods of the Romans and the Greeks, that based on emotion of how you were going to be judged? How would you like to go through life not knowing what sin was all about, not knowing anything about what God expects us to be right and wrong, and him saying, oh, by the way, on the last day I'm going to judge you? Wouldn't your next question be, judged by what, or judged how? Well, we've got an open book test, okay, so we can understand that. But if the law had not been given, where would we be? It would be a pretty terrible thing. The uncertainty of going through this life knowing that we're going to be judged, but we're not going to know how. And so it was very important. It was critical that this law be given. Now, again, this giving of the law, this law giving at Mount Sinai, marks a very significant and important stage in the progress. This is the very beginning, the progress of God's revelations to man. It's going to be, he will continually fill us in as time goes along. But at the very beginning, he has to start somewhere. So he's going to start with the law giving to the people here. So the design was to give Israel an idea what the law really was, and the law which they were binding themselves to keep. This is the covenant. The covenant is being given here, and they are binding themselves to keep it. And as I had mentioned earlier, the law that's given here was not for the righteous people. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, it says, realizing the fact that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly, the sinners, the unholy, the worldly. And he goes on to give a litany of all of the people that the law was made for. So when Paul is writing to Timothy, he says realizing the fact that the law is not made. He does not say was not made, is not made. So the law is still in effect for the people in the world. The people in the world are those ones, the ungodly, the sinners, the unholy, the worldly, those who kill their fathers, mothers, murders. So the law is still in effect for them, because without the law, if the law wasn't in effect for them, then they couldn't be guilty of any sin, because they didn't know that there was a law against what they're doing. So the law is still in effect for those people. Not in the sense that they have to offer up sacrifices and things like that, because that's not necessarily part of the Ten Commandments here. But those were actually for transgressions against the law. So the law is still in effect for people in the world. So it's proper that God start his revelations with the people by giving the law. Now, the sin that the law was going to bring to light, because that's what the law was, when you have a law, then when you sin, it brings to light that there was a transgression, that there was a sin against the law, a breaking of the law. Didn't have a proper atonement for it yet, as we know. There were ceremonial atonements, like I mentioned a little while ago. First 7 chapters of Leviticus deals with a lot of those, but not the final great sacrifice that was going to be brought by Christ himself. So God's forgiveness under this first covenant wasn't actually a remission, but more of a passing over. Romans 3:25 says, because in God's merciful restraints, he let the sins previously committed go unpunished. And in Hebrews 9:15, for the redemption of the violations that were committed under the first covenant. Okay, that's what Christ came to atone for. So the laws here that we're talking about in this chapter, that made claims against the sinner, while as yet there was no ability for them to be free of those yet. They could offer up sacrifices, but that just rolled it over. So the law, just as part of the covenant with Israel, it could not justify and it could not sanctify. All it did is it sentenced people under sin and left them there. Okay? It couldn't even fulfill the lower duty of restraining outward corruption. Just because you've got a law, it still didn't help people to be able to avoid or not commit some of the sins. The law couldn't keep sin in check. Okay, it could give commandments written on stone, but it had no power to write them on the fleshly tablets of the heart. And we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that is explained, that's what the intent of the new covenant was. So I want to kind of close out with this. I want to read verses 19 through 25. He says there, when the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke and God answered him with thunder. Then the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, go down, warn the people so that they do not break through to the Lord to stare. They're going to go up, and that's about all they could do is stare. Okay. And many of them perish. Verse 22. Also have the priest who approach the Lord consecrate themselves, or else the Lord will break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set boundaries around the mountain and consecrate it. Then the Lord said to him, go down and come up again, you and Aaron with you, and do not let the priest and the people break through to come to the Lord, or he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. Moses said, hey, you already told them once, and God says, no, you go back down and you tell them again, all right? So this is that renewed warning that God is putting on Moses to go down and tell them. So God, probably by a very loud voice, preceding this here, he is calling Moses up from the top of the mountain, probably a really, it's like when you're little and all of a sudden you hear mom or dad with a really loud voice call you. It's like, okay, this is not good. All right. So as soon as he went up, he was sent back down to remind the people to keep within their bounds. So what was the reason? So that people don't break through to the Lord to stare and they would die. So what does this passage here teach us? First off, that the heart is naturally disobedient, okay? And even the most solemn circumstances that are surrounding all this, that God is recognizing that the Israelites could barely be constrained. So that's why the multiple warnings to Moses to go down and tell the people. So, these very restrictions, what does it cause in the people? It causes a temptation to cross the boundary. Because if God would never have said it, the people would not have probably even tried. Would you try to go up to a mountain that's burning with fire? I don't think that, I wouldn't anyway. Maybe some of you would. So to gratify that desire, they were threatened with death. You go up and you touch it, and you're going to die. So if the danger wasn't very real in God's mind, he wouldn't have sent Moses back down so quickly to really warn the people. So the presumption, okay, of really by some towards divine things, it sets them up and, you know, there's a saying, I'll kind of back up a little bit. You've probably heard the saying, familiarity breeds contempt. Well, it's a proverb, and what it means is extensive knowledge or of a close association with someone or something leads to a loss of respect for them of it. All right, well, we've got a couple examples of that. So God is trying to, my goal here is to help us to understand that God wants them to respect him. You come near me, you're going to die. If they would not have had boundaries and they would have come close, there would have been a loss of respect because that familiarity breeds contempt. Okay, here's a couple examples. Okay, there's three of them that I'll bring up. When the ark was being returned from the Philistines, remember it was on a cart after it had been lost in the days of Eli, the prophet. The men of Beth Shemesh looked into it, and the Lord struck them dead. And then Uzzah, remember the guy with the ark? You think, well, you know, he wasn't trying to do anything evil, and I don't think that he was trying to do anything evil. But when you read the background of the story, why was Uzzah willing to reach out his hand? Because Uzzah was one of the sons, Ahio was the other son of Abinadab. Abinadab was the house where the ark was staying for the previous months. And God had blessed the house of Abinadab. So do you think that the sons had this feeling of familiarity with the ark? That, hey, God is blessing us, blessed our whole family, and maybe that caused a little bit less reverence than what should have been there. And then lastly, Uzziah. He was king over 50 years. God had blessed him tremendously. He's the one that decided it was okay for him to go on into the temple and offer up sacrifices. And he comes out with leprosy. So that familiarity breeds a little bit of contempt there as well. So, you know, it's hard to underestimate how rebellious the human heart really can be. So Moses is told twice to warn the people about the boundaries. So one of the goals of the law was to show the uselessness of attempts to restrain wickedness by the system of mere bounds. What is needed is not bounds, but a renewal of our heart. And we'll get into a little bit more of that at some other time. But so this morning we went over the preparations of the people to meet God, and then God's descent on the mountain, and then the boundaries that God has set up around the mountain. So each one of those is a first meeting with God and his awesomeness, and he's still the same God today, but as a fatherly God for us as well.